This video is from an interview with Redline TV with one of Left Horizon supporters, Ray Goodspeed. The interview discusses about whether socialists should support trans rights, and Ray Goodspeed makes an excellent contribution on how his perspectives have changed over time and that we should be united in supporting trans people against sexism and capitalism. Marxists should support trans rights. There really is no other clear way about it. Take a cue from the Bolshevik. The Bolshevik were ahead of anyone's time. The legalization of abortion, giving the same rights to women on the grounds for divorce. Lenin could not see a society where women were unequal to men. These ideas were way ahead of their time, and yet we are still having regressive conversations about trans today. And there seems to be a particular discourse on the left, particularly Marxists. The struggle can only be won if we're all unified. We must organize and unite together to truly defeat capitalism. Thank you, Redline TV, for this great interview. Thank you, Ray, for giving an excellent contribution, and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Ray Goodspeed. You've written two very informative articles, we thought, on the issue of trans people in Left Horizons.
Thank you very much.
You're actually a gay man who has changed his view on the issue of trans rights. Could you just briefly explain that?
Well, I changed my view to some degree. I was never anti-trans. I don't think as a gay man it's reasonable to be anti-trans, of course. But I certainly shared many of the very commonly expressed concerns that people have about the question of women's spaces and definitions and the scientific, the dialectical materialist kind of idea of what's science. And so I had lots of concerns around those issues. What I discovered actually by talking to both sides, luckily I do have friends on both sides I can have sensible discussion, is that the anti-trans side is mainly, their objections are kind of philosophical, deeply philosophical. And they start with a philosophical position, then look for examples to support them. In many ways, they build up a kind of a hypothetical kind of risk, a hypothetical or completely exaggerated risk to support their existing philosophical position. Whereas my real interest is just the daily lives of trans people, how they live their life, what they want to do, go shopping, try on some clothes, go for a wee, go to work, go to the toilet, come home, watch telly, not be humiliated in public, And that's where I base myself, and I think that any genuine problems you have of conflicting interests, I think can be pragmatically and practically solved. And so I've come over, if you like, much more to the trans position. There's no point pretending otherwise.
And from your articles, we've really got the impression that you've done a lot of work on the issue, and you've become something of an expert, which is why we've asked you on. You're not trans, but you know a lot about it.
No, I have to say I'm not a woman, and I'm not trans, and so therefore I speak for just myself, really. I'm a Marxist speaking for himself. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I certainly have spoke to lots of gender critical people, and I also spoke to, including trans people who are gender critical, and I also spoke to lots of trans people who support the more mainstream pro-trans view, certainly.
So could you describe perhaps what is actually involved? Because I don't think lots of people know that. If you're, a 16-year-old in school and you're thinking there's something, this doesn't feel right, I don't feel right in my body, what's involved with this process? You read some of the papers and you think you just, you get medication, you get surgery offered like that. What's actually involved?
Well, there's three stages really to a transition, and not every trans person goes through all three. Certainly under 16s, if they transition at all, it's social transition. They change their name, their hairstyle, their clothes. They might try and change the pitch of their voice. They're known as a particular name or gender at school and so on. Then, of course, over 16, but actually in practice much later, you can get actual hormone therapy, which is not the same as puberty blockers, but hormone therapy, which can actually change secondary sexual characteristics. Ultimately, there's surgical interventions, which to varying degrees, which trans people have varying wish to have done. It depends. I think the people say about, the biggest problem for trans people actually is the enormous waiting list. The idea that you can just somehow pop along to the doctor, go to a gender clinic the next week and get some hormones and get some surgery booked in is just so ridiculous, because the waiting times for the first appointment is 2 years and more now. And then sometimes you wait another 2 years for the second appointment. So, then to get hormones, you have to go through endocrinologists, and they have to give their consent. It's like a very long and involved process. I think about 1% of trans people of the population are trans, and of course, not all trans people have dysphoria, and you don't need dysphoria as such, but the vast majority of trans people have dysphoria to some degree. And transitioning helps to relieve that dysphoria. It doesn't make you a woman or a man by transitioning. You're already that as an internal thing. What it does, it gives you the ability to pass more in society, to be more identified and get respect in that gender in wider society. And it stops you from looking like the person you don't want to be, or, you know, it makes you look more like the person you do want to be. It doesn't actually make you transitioning, it just makes it easier to exist as a trans person.
What about the issue of puberty blockers then? When can you get them, or are they given to children as we've
No, puberty blockers are, I mean, by no means the majority of people who go to gender clinics actually get puberty blockers. It's a very much minority thing. And they're overwhelmingly given to people aged like 14, 15, 16, 15 and 16 mainly. Some get it earlier, but very small numbers get it earlier. And it's prescribed in extreme cases of dysphoria where you're trying to alleviate the distress of a particular trans youth who's, you know, they've been used for decades for cases of precocious puberty. So what that means is that those people who went through puberty much too young, aged like 7 and 8 and so on, which is obviously socially very distressing to go through puberty so young. And so they give them puberty blockers to delay it. And then eventually when the age is right, they can stop the puberty blockers and then their puberty develops in the normal way. So using the same process, puberty blockers for trans kids just gives them a breathing space. It stops them from developing secondary characteristics because they may already have socially transitioned at school. They've transitioned into being a trans boy, and then through puberty they start growing breasts, and that's fantastically dysphoric. I mean, that's not what they want to do because they've been accepted at school as a boy generally. They're reversible. Once you stop taking them, then your puberty kicks in. Of course, with every medicine, there are some side effects, but these have to be medically monitored as you're on them, and they are. And I think you have to balance the medical consensus demonstrates a hugely beneficial effect in some cases of some trans young people of taking this stuff, weighed against some of the side effects. And I think the balance of medical opinion is that it's worth doing. And the courts now finally agree, I'm glad to say.
The current disagreements between some radical feminists and trans activists tends to be going back to 2017, I believe, when the government proposed that a change to the Gender Recognition Act, and there should be a self-certification. Can you describe this issue a little bit?
Well, the gender recognition certificates are purely to regulate a trans person's interface, if you like, with some aspects of the state. So it means you can change your birth certificate, which means you can then get married as a woman. You can then, or man, depending on which way you go. But I mean, I have to say, women get all the crap on this. They're the centre of this storm. But it's a massive red herring. I mean, it enables you to sort out your pension and marriage and that kind of legalistic stuff. Most trans people don't have one. There's only 4,000 been issued since 2004, which is when they started. Most trans people don't have them. It's been very cleverly conflated with the self-ID issue, the idea that, oh, well, this is a new assault. If anyone can suddenly just decide they're a man or a woman, especially if they decide to be a woman, that's going to give a whole new layer of risk. But of course, nothing of the kind, because no one is ever asked for a gender recognition certificate before they go into a ladies' toilet. There's nobody on the door of a changing room in Marks and Spencer saying, please, can I see your GRC? So, and if there were, by the way, you would have masculine-looking cis women challenged at the door just to check, are you really a woman or have you got your certificate? Let's see, prove it. And how would a cis woman prove that she had it? If she didn't have a certificate, how would she prove that she's actually a woman? You know, all these things, even women's refuges, even prisons, when they're deciding where to send someone, have not used the gender recognition certificates as like the absolute line. So actually, the change to GRA would have no effect on women's spaces at all. That's just so bizarre about this whole debate.
You're actually in favor of counselling, though, aren't you, for trans people? They should have counselling or proper medical discussions.
Well, I mean, not all trans people need counselling. Some trans people just know they're trans, and that's fine, and they can get on with it, and they can live their life to whatever they want. However, I think a lot of young people, especially, and older people, aren't so absolutely sure. They come to the whole issue with their own kind of questions and doubts, and the need to talk it through with a professional who's talked to other trans people. So it's beneficial, I think, in the main for people to have these sort of discussions. And also, of course, if you're talking about actual medical intervention, then of course there is a duty of care before somebody gets irreversible medical treatment to make sure that they're not doing something lightly or light-mindedly, particularly if they're younger. I think you do need to make sure that people aren't going to take an irrevocable step that they later regret. And of course, it's in everybody's interest. This is what I don't understand, really. It's in no one's interest to have loads of people making a mistake and then detransitioning. It's a bad look for the entire trans community anyway. And so what we want is to people to make sure that before they take those steps. And I think that's what counselling can do. And it might just be useful to talk through. There might be all sorts of other issues in the family home. There might be issues of general depression or other family dysfunction that need to be sort of looked through. And it's just useful to go and chat these things through. And that does happen. That's exactly what happens in the gender clinics. If there was, although you have to wait years for your appointment, that's the point. It's not like we want more counselling, not less of it.
Getting to the issue of being trans, nurture, nature, bit of both, similar to the gay issue, isn't it? Homosexuals.
Well, it is that. You said that. I mean, can I just hit on the head one myth about trans people do not deny the reality of biological sex. I mean, certainly the issue of biological sex is a lot more complicated at the margins than people ever thought it was, but we haven't got really time to go into that now. But in general terms, most people fit into two biological sexes, and we all know what that means. Trans people are more aware of those differences than anybody else in the world because they obsess about them. They look in a mirror and look at their hairline, the jaw structure, the shape of their nose, eye, all of these things they're obsessed with. So of course they know that. The medical consensus clearly is that gender, which doesn't match with your biological sex, also exists. And gender is socially constructed. Now, what does that mean? It means that in most cases, people, their gender will match biological sex, but in some cases it doesn't. And this is a social construct. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a choice, that you can be that you can just decide on Wednesdays and Fridays that you're going to be a woman or a man. This is a deep-seated psychosocial reality, very similar to being gay. Now, the issue is, are you born trans? I have to speak just purely for my own situation here. I do not believe that people are born gay. A lot of gay people do, and they get a great deal of comfort out of that because it's not my fault. I'm gay. I was born this way. Fine, if that's what you need to say. And some trans people say, I'm born in the wrong body, But I don't actually think it's genetic, but I do think it's laid down in early life. It's part of the core personality, just like being homosexual. And I think it's probably not genetic, but it's probably just, like most things are, an interplay of genetics and society and like epigenetics as well. You have the kind of, as you develop in society, that also changes your brain. There are some experiments say that there are similarities between brains of trans men and cis men. The research is out there, but in the end of the day, the research, it's like an academic question. Trans people evidently exist. Medical, psychological consensus is that they exist. And there's not really anything you can do apart from that. You can either make their lives harder or not make their lives harder. That's the choice we face, really.
And talking about that, I mean, trans women get a lot more crap than trans men. Well,
it's sexism. I mean, they're victims of what some people call trans misogyny. Of course, they're victims of this because to become a woman voluntarily is the worst thing you can do in a sexist society. It's like, why would you give up? Why would you become this oppressed minority? And it's true that, that's why there is actually an automatic kind of alliance between feminists and trans women, by the way, which some radical feminists, and it's similar with effeminate gay men, so-called cis men, there's much more stigma attached to like effeminate gay men, or in some societies, passive gay men than active gay men, And this also explains the numbers difference because it's so much more stigma changing from boy to girl or from man to woman. The numbers of people transitioning from so-called female to male are higher. And that particularly was the case in 2016, 2017, when there was a great deal of panic about a kind of a sudden upsurge in the numbers of girls, so-called girls, transitioning into being trans boys. But that's leveled off actually since then. There was a huge increase when there was a lot of publicity. And that's kind of leveled off now, and it's actually dipping a little.
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, as a Marxist, like you, I'm a Marxist. I'd like to overcome all of our divisions, etc. But it strikes me that ID politics here is a very odd thing, where trans and women are now opposing each other rather than they're both oppressed. Trans women and trans men, even more so than women. But that seems to be something that really needs to be overcome if we're even close against socialism.
The philosophical problem of it is, and we haven't got time to get into this really, but the philosophical problem is I think trans people and women can be united in overthrowing a sexist society, because I don't see the enemy as being men, as being people who possess a penis. Now, if you have a philosophical position where the enemy are people who are actually physically men, and they are by definition the enemy, then the division is built in. And I want to unite people against capitalism, against sexism, on a basis of equality and justice. I did want to just mention the question of regret as well, about detransitioning. I mentioned that we touched on it before, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that as well, just briefly, because I think you see a lot of statistics that say, so 70% of young people change their mind and then they turn out not going. Well, fine. Of course, it's true that you get 5-year-olds who play with dolls, or they're very sort of tomboyish, and then by puberty they suddenly bloom, so to speak, and become more fit in more with their biological kind of gender, as it were. Of course, that's true. And no one transes these people. The overwhelming majority of people who go to gender identity clinics are like 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And in that, overwhelmingly 14, 15, 16. And of course, so they desist, but that's not a detransition. You can't say, oh, a 5-year-old who thinks he might be a girl and then he changes his mind. That's not detransitioning. Detransitioning is when you go to a clinic, you declare yourself trans, you live as trans. It's a persistent feeling through puberty and adolescence. And then you perhaps take some sort of medical intervention and then you desist. But of course, it's very interesting. The figures probably say that of those people, it's probably about 1% of people detransition. And of those, there's some research to suggest that more than half of them are people who actually still consider themselves to be trans, but don't get enough social support or family support, or they live in a country where it's impossible, or in America, they live in a state where it's impossible. And they think twice, and they delay the transition. And sometimes after, say, 10 years, when they're living more independently or have moved to a different state, they come back and complete their transition. Mm-hmm. So the idea of detransitioning, of course, anyone who makes a mistake and takes surgery or hormones and then detransition, that's a tragedy. That's a massive personal tragedy. And it's in everyone's, trans and cis and everyone, gay and straight, to prevent that from happening.
Can you give us an idea? I mean, we say 1% of the population might be trans, but how many of them actually transition in the sense of surgery?
Well, that's it. I mean, as I said earlier, maybe only about half of those actually are trans in terms of anybody who knows. These things are always very, very difficult to assess. And there's a whole question of non-binary people, which we haven't touched on really. There's a whole question of non-binary people, which is another whole confusion. Bless them. They're not confused, but the issue is confusing. So, I think, in terms of daily life, that you're going to run into 1 out of 200. And I think that there's so few of them that most people in the labour movement who have these concerns about spaces and predatory men and da-di-da-di-da that you see so often. The trouble is, most of them will never meet, or have never and may never meet, a trans person. And so it's like gay people in the 60s and 70s, where nobody knew an openly gay person. So all of the kind of myths and nonsense about gay people could thrive because nobody knew any real ones. Once gay people started coming out in vast numbers, and every family kind of had one almost, then, my family can't sustain these Dickens myths because they know me, and now because of me, partly, other younger members of my family also come out, and so I think a lot of the problems is that people think of transgender people as some kind of monster over there because they actually don't know one. I was lucky enough to work with somebody who transitioned from female to male at work, and it was lovely to see an absolute blossoming of their personality, his personality. Fantastic to see. And once you see that, then you have to be pretty hard-hearted to start saying, oh no, but you must go to the ladies' toilet still, Sid. You must go to the ladies' toilet. You can't come in here. We're gonna make it. You're gonna have to go to the toilet in a place where everybody else is dressed like men, and you go in dressed like a woman, and we want you to piss in there, walking past the urinals. What's the purpose of that? Who gains from that? It's very strange.